Hiya 10. Um, Second of my video lessons about distinctive landscapes, which is the topic that you're trying to do at home. I hope you're all well. It's very weird not being at school. I'd much prefer to be teaching you face to face, but here goes. So, just a little recap of what you should have done already in your exercise books. This picture here that you can see, Sidmouth, what is distinctive about it? So you might get a picture in an exam. It probably won't be of Sidmouth, it would be of another place, but it might ask you to state what is distinctive about the place in front of you or the figure that you looked at. So if we are looking at Sidmouth, the kind of factors that we could talk about are the climate. So in this picture, it looks beautiful and sunny, blue, clear skies. Not always like that, but obviously you've only got the photo as evidence. The geology, so the rock type, Sidmouth's red sandstone cliffs are definitely something that makes it really distinctive, so much so that it's part of your logo on your uniforms. Then human activity is another factor which really does make Sidmouth distinctive. So like the Jacob's Ladder, which is really clear in the photograph. Also the kind of offshore breakwaters and the rock groins, which actually makes Sidmouth quite distinctive as well. Not to mention the town itself and its white Georgian hotel buildings and so on. And the relief, which hopefully you remember from last lesson, is the height and shape of the land. So Sidmouth is really, really distinctive because you can see it from a distance, actually. Sidmouth Gap, it's called. So basically, you've got the two cliffs either side. So you've got Pennington Point and Peak Hill. And then you've got the gap in the middle, which is Sidmouth and the Sid Valley. So it's really distinctive relief. And the exam question that you should have had a go at, but if you haven't, you could have a go at now. You could pause it. This is the type of question you might get in an exam, and it would say, describe two factors that affect distinctive landscapes in the UK. Refer to named examples in your answer. So if you were going to answer this question, you would need to pick two of the factors that are on this slide. So you might say one factor that affects distinctive landscapes in the UK is relief. And then you would explain how relief affects the landscape, and you would provide evidence or an example like Sidmouth. You would then say another factor that affects distinctive landscapes in the UK is the geology, and you would explain how the geology affects the landscape and then provide some evidence or an example. So you're peeing. So you're making your point, you're explaining your point, and you are providing evidence or an example to support your point. Right, so today's lesson, if you write the heading in your exercise books, the first key question on the syllabus is what are distinctive landscapes and how are they created? We've started looking at that already in your last lesson, but today's main learning objective is actually the second bullet point here. So if you want to write this in your exercise book, we're going to try and understand how headlands and bays are created. So you might want to pause this while you write that out. Just the second bullet point here. So to understand how headlands and bays are created. If you have a copy of the textbook, you might want to look at page 84, 85 and 86 as we're going through this. It might help. If not, I have put photographs of the textbook on Show My Home. Okay, so this is just an example of what distinctive means. So I think we already know this. Basically, distinctive means something that distinguishes that place from others. So something that would be distinctive about Sidmouth would be the red sandstone cliffs, because they're something that distinguish Sidmouth from other places. Oops, it's a text message. Sorry about that. Okay, so this landform here, this is Old Harry Rocks, which are a really famous landform in the UK, in Dorset, so not that far away. You can always Google that if you want to, maybe print a picture of Old Harry Rocks and put it in your book. But the question is, and I would be asking you for ideas if this was a real lesson, but obviously it's a bit of a strange lesson, which I'm not too keen on. I can't ask you for your kind of ideas, but have a little look at that and think about what processes, what might have happened to create that landform. And then, so basically the next 2 slides, I'm going to have a go at trying to explain to you how that landform's been created. So Old Harry Rocks are basically a headland. And a headland is a piece of land that's jutting out into the sea. So Pennington Point is a headland. Jacob's Ladder has a headland. Peak Hill has a headland. Orcombe Point in Exmouth is a headland. So a headland is basically a bit of rock that's quite hard that is sticking out into the sea. And the reason you get that is because if you look at the image on this slide, you have got on the left, as you're looking at it, you've got a diagram of a cliff, and you've got the cliffs made up of different rock types. So you've got hard rock, then you've got soft rock, hard rock, soft rock. And you're imagining that you're looking at this from above, okay? So the waves are attacking this coastline and they erode the less resistant or the softer rock much more quickly than they erode the hard rock. So over time, what happens is that stretch of coastline looks more like the diagram on the right of the slide. So basically, you get this kind of pattern where you have a headland where the hard rock is left sticking out into the sea as rocky outcrops. Then you have bays, which have formed due to rapid erosion. So where the cliffs or the coastline's been eroded really quickly. And if you think about it, you could think about the whole of the South Devon coast, and you can kind of think that we've got Headland Bay, and it might be worth actually having a little look at that on Google, kind of looking up on a map. So you've got Exmouth, for example, then you've got Orcombe Point, then you've got Sandy Bay behind that, then you've got another headland, then you've got Budleigh Salterton, and then you've got another headland, and then you've got Ladram Bay and another headland, and then you've got Sidmouth, or Jacob's Ladder first, then Sidmouth, then Pennington Point, and going on to places like Beer, Branscombe, and so on. And basically, the coastline is defined by those headland bay, headland bay, headland bay. This happens on something called a discordant coastline. And discordant coastlines are basically where the rock along the coast is at right angles to the sea. So it's where you have hard rock, then soft rock, hard rock, soft rock, hard rock, soft rock. And that gives rise to these headlands and bays. Okay, so then what you've got is a headland. So imagine you've got hardish rock that's sticking out into the sea, and next to it you've got the bay. This image on this slide is basically a headland. And what happens to the headland is that although it's quite hard and it's quite resistant to erosion, it's sticking out into the sea. So any waves and any energy is going to hit that headland quite powerfully. And a series of processes operate to actually create some quite distinctive landforms on a headland. So what happens first is all cliffs have got weaknesses. So if you look at part A on the diagram, you've got weaknesses in the cliff. And if you look at the cliffs in Sidmouth when you're out doing your exercise, walking along the beach or something, the cliffs have got weaknesses. And what happens when the waves hit the cliff, the water and the air is forced into those weaknesses. So it goes into the weaknesses and it causes the weaknesses to get bigger and bigger. And then sometimes, and over time, the cliff will start to crumble. So it may end up forming a cave, like you can see location B on the diagram. So a cave usually forms at the base of the cliff, although you can get caves halfway up the cliff as well. And the waves are then going to continuously, particularly at high tide, but continuously hit the entrance to the cave, and waves are going to go into the cave. And if the waves are carrying sediment, so if you think about Sidmouth, the sea always looks really murky because it's carrying lots of sand. And those little particles of sand scratch away at the base of the cave and the sides of the cave in a process called abrasion. So it's a bit like kind of scratchy sponge scraping away a dirty frying pan. The sand sort of scratches away at the cliff, and gradually the cave gets bigger and bigger until eventually it may, depending on the type of headland, it may erode all the way through, creating an arch like part C on the diagram. So part C on the diagram is an arch, and the arch is then continuously eroded at the bottom by the sea. So again, abrasion, the scraping away at the base of the arch is happening. Hydraulic action, where the force of the air and water is getting into the cracks at the bottom of the cliff. But you also have the processes of weathering, which we talked about in a previous lesson, happening at the top of the cliff. So, for example, biological weathering, where trees, so the roots of trees might be penetrating into the rock and causing the rock to crumble. And if you want to look at my daughter's Daisy's Bites about geography, she explains biological weathering there. Also, freeze thaw or mechanical weathering, where rainwater might get into cracks in the top of the cliff, cause the cliff to start crumbling, and eventually the roof of the arch may collapse, and you're left with a stump like part D on the diagram. And that is Old Harry from one of the previous slides. So that landform in Dorset that I showed you on a couple of slides back is a stack like D. And then the stack is continuously eroded, and it's also weathered at the top. And sometimes it will topple over, and sometimes it will just become much smaller and it will form a stump like part E on the diagram. And stumps often aren't seen because they're covered up by water, especially at high tide. So that explains how the headland is eroded. Not all headlands erode in exactly this order, but quite a few do. Right. What I want you to do then from all of this, using the textbook if you want, using BBC Bite Size if you want, is to create a double page which explains all of this. So erosion of a headland on a discordant coast. So you'll need to either print or draw the two diagrams that are on the slide, and then write an explanation of what a discordant coast is and how headlands and bays are formed, and also explain the process that happens on the headland. So maybe drawing the diagram and then labelling part A, B, C, D and E to explain what happens. The other thing I'd like you to do is to create a glossary of the words that I've listed in the yellow box, and you can use the back of the textbook, the glossary, to actually write those definitions. If you're not so good at writing or your presentation isn't great, then you could print this slide and then you can just fill the gaps with the words on the previous slide. So, and then you can just stick that into your book, which will explain the erosion of a headland on a discordant coastline. So then what I'd like you to do is have a little look at this YouTube link, which is a really good explanation of some of the things we've learnt. Make some notes. So you might want to do a spider diagram or a list, bullet point list of notes as you're watching. And then there'll be a Kahoot quiz if I can work out how to get you to do that while we're not in class, or I will transfer the Kahoot quiz on to show my homework. And finally, I'd like you to have a go at this exam question in your books. So it's only a 3-mark question, so you'd only spend 3 to 4 minutes doing that. And when you've had a go, if you could take a picture or email your answer to me, that would be fantastic. Hope it all makes sense. Obviously, go back and listen again, watch the video again, go on to BBC Bite Size, watch Daisy's Bites if you want to, and hopefully you now understand headlands and bays and how a headland is created. Bye.